Now we have a new panel. It's the last one before lunch, and it's going to be a valuable one as we're hearing from the key individuals in the food rescue sector. So we're all going to go into lunch feeling really good. As you've heard this morning, Australia produces more food than it needs, yet millions of Australians are food insecure. And as a journalist, I'm just wondering whether your industry needs to say, instead of food insecure, hungry. It's a bit more powerful, but anyway. I'm no expert. And with the cost of living continuing to rise, it's particularly timely today to have such an esteemed panel to share their views on how Australia can better meet the twin needs of increasing food security while reducing food waste. Please welcome to the stage the facilitator, Carolyn Cameron from Stop Food Waste Australia, Brianna Casey, CEO of Foodbank, Ronnie Kahn, CEO of OzHarvest, Steve Clifford, CEO of Second Bite, and Georgie Alley, the agribusiness sector lead at KPMG. What a panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to be here today. My role in Stop Food Waste Australia is I lead the sector action plans, and it's a great privilege for me to be with these guys today. I'm delighted to have the conversation. We're going to explore it from the concept of from farm to fork, understanding the opportunities for food rescue and challenges for food rescue along the way. The Australian Food Pact and Stop Food Waste Australia and the Fight Food Waste CRC are very committed, and we're embedding food rescue and what we can do to improve that into the way that we do business. For example, one of the 9 commitments that companies can sign up to in the Australian Food Pact is to maximise the potential to donate surplus food. I've had the privilege of working with these guys and their officers over the last 2.5 years to create a sector action plan to really, and now we're starting to implement it and see some of the change that happens with that and the momentum that occurs. So we're going to take this journey across the supply chain. We're going to start today with Georgie Ali. And Georgie's from KPMG. She's going to take us through the tax incentive. And the tax incentive is to get food from farm to the DC. And then we'll go through the rest of the food supply chain. So over to you, Georgie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks for the opportunity to provide an update today on the tax incentive work that has been underway. And many of you will have read the report that was released in 2020 around the design and the opportunity to look at an incentive that we've seen in overseas markets that's worked very well as one of the key levers we can look at around food waste reduction or redirection of food from landfill into organisations such as the 3 we have on stage. So I'll talk through today the recent work that we've done around the implementation analysis. So just in terms of the organisations, of course, that have been involved in this journey, and I'd like to recognise, of course, the Fight Food Waste CRC, Foodbank, OzHarvest, also the Queensland Department of Environment and Science and the New South Wales EPA, who supported this implementation analysis work. So where have we come from? So many of you will be aware of the National Food Waste Tax Incentive thought leadership paper that was released in 2020. And that really started to pull together, well, what was this concept? How would it work in the Australian context? And what was the benefit that it would deliver around a reduction or positive impact around the broader food waste ecosystem? We looked, of course, at what was the direct cost, what would it be for the federal government to implement such an incentive, and as you'll see on the screen, that was estimated at around $522 million, and working out in terms of an average value of food, as detailed on the screen, of $6 per kilogram, and looking at around sort of 87 million kilograms of food donations on an annual basis. That worked through when we looked at the broader social, economic and environmental benefits of about a $2 billion return to the Australian economy through the implementation of such a tax incentive. So a lot of the thought leadership, the design, the work that went into that, and I do acknowledge other parties from within KPMG and more broadly, such as I know we've got Catherine Dean in the crowd as well, who are involved in that initial design of that piece of work. So what were we considering in this next piece when we started to look at the implementation analysis? So we had done the design, considered the concept of the tax incentive, but this was really now to go a layer below that to start to understand, well, what was the appetite, what was the behavioural change, what was the consideration that businesses need to make to whether they would adopt and start to participate in such an incentive. So we worked with 33 businesses right across that end-to-end value chain. So from production through to transport, distribution, processing, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, right through to food service organisations. And many of those were already making donations in terms of into the food relief system, and some were also considering the fact that there were some cost barriers and some potential inhibitors that were restricting their ability to really feed any of their waste or any of their surplus production into such a ecosystem, given some of the cost implications that they were experiencing. So what we did was take the feasibility study, of course, that was led by FIAL, and started to look at, well, what was the heat map that we saw across the key nodes in the supply chain where we had a lot of that surplus food, or where we had the opportunity to really intervene in terms of redirection of produce. And then we also looked at, from a food relief perspective and from these organisations on stage, is where were they seeing a lot of the demand. And of course, we've seen the latest hunger report, we've seen the increase over the last few years with COVID to drive a significant demand through the population in terms of accessing such relief. And so where were we seeing strong commodities, strong products that were requiring a lot more donation or redirection to support the broader population requirements that we had. So we layered those two dimensions, and then we started to identify that we really had a strong concentration, of course, on the East Coast, so Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and we also had strong demand around horticultural products, meat products, of course grain-based or carbohydrate-based products as well, which is probably no surprise to many in the room. From there, we really started to understand, okay, if we started to put a tax incentive in place, what was the value? How did people want to access the tax incentive? So did we want to do it through an annual tax lodgement process through the existing tax system? So whether that be through business activity statements, either lodged monthly, lodged quarterly. Did organisations consider the need to set up a whole new standalone reporting incentive like we have through the National R&D tax incentive process, which is lodged with the government at a particular time period in a very sort of standalone capacity? So we're starting to test a lot of these feasibility concepts and really understanding what was the best way and the easiest way for businesses to really adopt the incentive, and what did it mean through that adoption for them in terms of donations. So you'll see on the screen how we started to categorise businesses, what was the potential aggregated turnover of a company, recognising, of course, when we look at having, very much from a farm level right through to even wholesale and into that distribution, there are many smaller businesses who play in that space. So how did we look at them from an aggregated annual turnover of under 20 million? Right through to businesses over 20 million with an aggregated turnover to that scale, and of course paying different tax rates. So how did that start to flow through, either in a cash or refundable tax offset, or how did it translate into a credit position in terms of a non-refundable tax offset? So there's a bit of detail there that starts to show you what that net value of that tax incentive looks like. And this report, and of course the report from 2020, do go into a lot more detail around clearly taxation policy, how this fits in more broadly to some of the existing taxation support that is provided to those that already make donations, but how does this really go to the next step to recognise a lot of those incremental costs that we don't tend to capture when we think about food relief and redirecting. So whether that be running the distribution, of course the freight costs that come with that. When we have organisations who process or manufacture certain commodities to deliver an end product that goes into the food relief organisations, they haven't been able to access any incentive or financial support for providing that intermediary service. And so this was really starting to unpack and provide recognition at all parts of that value chain for the work that those organisations were delivering. So we tested this and started to gain feedback in terms of, would this incentivise companies to donate more? Does it really fit in terms of starting to recognise the scale of the costs and considerations they have in terms of when they do or don't make decisions to donate or redirect product into the food relief ecosystem? Was there organisations for the case that it just didn't work, even if we had a tax incentive in place, that it just wasn't to the scale, the size of their business, or in many cases they'd been working to eliminate a lot of waste in their manufacturing processes or their production processes, and therefore, a tax incentive wasn't necessarily going to encourage them to produce a new amount in terms of then directing that into the food relief system more broadly. So you'll see some of the commentary back there. I mean, a lot of feedback across the whole sector. There was a aligned consensus from all the organisations and businesses that we spoke to that this really was a game changer. And it really is quite a significant shift to start to recognise and provide that financial incentive through such a tax mechanism to allow them to play and to contribute more in this food relief ecosystem. So you'll see in this report a lot of that stakeholder feedback. And how does it really start to recognise, as I said, a lot of those incremental costs, and particularly some of those logistics and transport costs that we haven't been able to capture before. So just in terms of next steps, and for many in the room who either might be new to the National Food Donation Tax Incentive or really interested in finding out more, this report will be released today in terms of how that implementation analysis could work. So we do encourage you to jump online. It'll be available both on the KPMG website and many of the organisations on stage, and of course the Fight Food Waste CRC. But there is a letter of support. There is still work to be done in terms of working with the federal government. How do you start to model this through the Treasury balance sheets, and how does this flow through to the true implication in terms of implementing it as a new policy? And so this letter of support is really crucial. So we do encourage those in the room who do participate or have strong support for this tax incentive to look at that letter of support, to sign it from an organisational perspective, and of course to feed it back through Food Bank or through the CRC to really ensure that we've got a collective industry voice around the tax incentive, and hopefully we'll see this become a reality in Australia in the not too distant future. So thank you.
Thanks, Georgie. Thanks, Georgie. That was great. It was a lovely overview. So I encourage you all to go and get copies of it and to think about whether your organisation could sign that letter of support. Brianna, from a food bank perspective, the food bank's been very involved with this project from the get-go. What difference would this mean to the food rescue sector, having the tax incentive?
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you very much for having me. And I do wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're variously meeting today, both here in Brisbane as well as across the country, and recognise anyone in the audience of a First Nations background. As Georgie said, this will be a game changer, not only in terms of sustainability and food waste reduction as well as food loss reduction, but more importantly from my perspective, in ensuring that those who are going hungry in Australia have got access to fresh, nutritious, culturally appropriate food. It is ludicrous from my perspective that we do not have a tax incentive available to incentivise people to do more in the food donation space. We know that the farmers, the manufacturers, the retailers, the transport and logistics companies who are so routinely and wonderfully and generously donating food and groceries to the food relief organisations on the stage in front of you, but they're doing it out of the goodness of their own heart. There is no financial incentive. In fact, we know that for many businesses, it costs them more to donate than it would to dump, because not only are they having to pick and pack the product that hasn't made it to market, so they've already copped a loss, but they're then having to go on with the transport costs, and then we're having to handle it and distribute it. So it would be a game changer. We know in the US and Canada and multiple European countries where these tax incentives exist, they are game changers. In fact, we know ReFed, which is the US version of Stop Food Waste Australia, have identified this as the single biggest intervention in terms of reducing food loss and food waste. If not now, then when? It is a compelling ask for the federal government. We need these tax reforms. They will be a game changer. Not only will we be helping the government reach any number of its United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, help with our state of environment reporting, but we know on any given day in Australia, more than 500,000 households are going hungry. Wouldn't it be better for us to be providing this essential food relief to those families than to landfill?
So thanks, Brianna. That's a real call to action if there ever was one. You all have your apps, and if there are any questions that you want to start putting through, we'll have some at the end. But in the meantime, we'll follow our way along the supply chain. We've gone now from farm to the distribution centre with the tax incentive. Now we're going to go to retail. And we'd like to talk to Steve Clifford from Second Bite about how you're interacting with the retailers, and what are the 2 or 3 things that you think it can make a change in that space?
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks for having us here today. Thinking about the 3 key things that I've seen over the last year or so that I think will pan out in the future to be really useful in this space. 3 items come to mind. Sector collaboration, that's really working well. We've done a lot more of that in recent times. I can expand on that. A better understanding of our agency's needs is critical in that retail space, and finding new sources of food that at the moment we're not trapping, that's going to waste. From Second Bite's point of view, we're very focused on one thing, and that's maximising the amount of food we can take that's destined for landfill and getting it to hungry Australians. I understand Food Bank and OzHarvest, your remit and what you do is broader, but that's very much our focus. It's what we've always done. It may change in the future to go broader, but in that focus, the last 2 years we've taken about 25 million kilos of good edible food and made sure that that's got to Australians who need it through using our wonderful agency partners, and that's what we'll be focusing on. So these 3 areas, if I could just expand on them a little bit more to explain why I think they're the future and why they are really important in this space. On the collaboration front, I'm very proud that the 3 of us, Brianna, Ronnie and myself, we signed a letter at the start of the year to all the major political parties as a sector on our 3 letterheads. Now, you 2 have told me that's the first time that's been done in the sector, that we've actually had a joint letter. So I think that's a really important start for how this sector can show collaboration. We ask for support on funding, for emergency relief, funding for the food sector for those who have faced food insecurity all through the year, not just when there's a crisis. And we also ask for commitments in relation to the tax incentive. So to me, it was the content of the letter was really important, but I was really chuffed about the fact that we finally got a letter out together. And then, rather than resting on our laurels while we're blowing our own trumpets, about a month ago we sent another letter when New South Wales, the New South Wales report came out and said there's some good news here and what we're asking for. We thought, well, this is a good opportunity for us to put out another release calling for those same 3 areas. I think we speak with a consistent voice. We speak as the 3 of us in one boat instead of going off in separate pushes, perhaps as we've done in the past. That's really powerful. So that's the national collaboration. On the collaboration at a state level, there's a number of examples I could use, but probably one of the most recent ones and close to home, because I'm from Victoria, in relation to the Victorian floods relief. There's been a Victorian government task force set up during COVID times and just to deal with these various issues. It seems no sooner have we got through bushfires, then we had COVID, and then we had floods, and then we've got cost of living. So I think we need emergency task forces that are there for it seems to be the business as usual. There's an emergency of some sort in Australia. But in Victoria, we've used this task force. When the floods came, the government said, we want all of you to work together. And of course, when you're a funder, you've got the ability to encourage change. And another theory of mine is that philanthropists could do a good job by forcing all of us in a way. Here's the funding, but maybe we'll give you $40 for 3 of you instead of $10 each, and there's an incentive for us to work together, because I think we can show we can do that. And how it manifested in this state floods area was normally in a situation like this, that the funding's provided to various agencies. We had the 3 of us, we had Fair Share, we had the regional food shares, and other government departments, other NGOs, all ready to make a contribution. And perhaps in the bad old days, the money would have come in and they would have rushed off to do, each of us would have rushed off to do the best we could with our resources. In this particular instance, through the sort of the infrastructure that had been set up previously during COVID, we actually came in on day one almost and said, okay, there's all these challenges, Victorian floods, how can we as a group work together, not all go off and do our best individually, but in different areas. And so, an example that comes to me is Second Bite was allocated a logistics piece. So we're responsible for making sure that the vans that need to go up and collect the food from where it's available, whether it's food rescue or sometimes food procurement, get that food and get it out to the various places that it's needed. How do we make sure that we do that efficiently and not have your van, Ronnie's van and my van on the same highway back and forth, which it's fair to say happens in other, at other times of the year when we're not as well organised as this. So I think that's been a great result. It's an encouragement to me that collaboration really does change the way we can make an impact, and we're all here to try and maximise our impact. The second area I mentioned was to do with understanding community needs. What are the needs of our frontline agencies? Traditionally, as a food rescue organisation like Second Bite, we take whatever food we can gratefully get from our generous supporters and donors and so on, and basically hand it over to agencies who may or may not necessarily have wanted that food. It's always been a bit of a disconnect. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do, and I know that my colleagues here are doing the same thing for the future to deal with this, not just skyrocketing demand in relation to quantity, but the type of food that people need. Is it culturally appropriate food? Is it food for people with allergies? The sort of finessing that we haven't really been able to focus with on so much on the past. But with that knowledge, by going out and speaking to them, it definitely improves the outcomes and impacts we can have. At the start of this year, Second Bite actually commissioned an independent survey of all our agencies around the country and so ask these sorts of questions. Getting the food you want, what could we do better? It was clear from them that 77% said we just have, the demand is way higher than it was last year. So the big call was, can you get us more food? And we're working on that, of course. But also questions about, I mentioned cultural appropriateness, but capacity. A number of them said, we've got plenty of people, perhaps, but we haven't got the facilities in our operations to cope with that. So for some of them, we've been able to give freezers, for example, and let them help with that. But the piece of food rescue organisations like ours, helping our agencies to increase their capability, understanding their needs, I think to me that's a really important second part of what we can all do and what we've been doing in the retail space. Technology, I should just add as a side point, is a big part of our reaching our vision of no food going to waste in Australia. We love to see in Australia all Australians have access to healthy food, no matter what their postcode or circumstances might be. Everyone in this room is trying to end food waste. So again, the technology piece is going to be part of it, to be more efficient. We're all resource strapped. None of us have got the funding or the resources we need. But to me, technology will be a part of that, serving those community agencies and understanding the data and getting data from them. And finally, quickly to wrap up, the third area I think we've noticed change in recent times, and already this morning there's been a lot of talk about it. We're talking about the food pack and the manufacturers. It's sourcing new areas of food. We've, at Second Bite, been very focused on supermarkets, and we have a wonderful 11-year collaboration with Coles and Fair Share we work with well, and even Yumi, who'll be speaking later today. Lots of collaborations there, but where can we get food from other than where we've traditionally got it from? And the obvious space, if you look at that pie chart of food waste, Ronnie and your colleagues, I know you're looking very much at household waste as Stop Food Waste Australia. We think for us initially, the space we could work is in going to primary producers and farms, that farm gate piece, and which is around a quarter of the pie chart. Whereas the supermarkets piece is a sliver, it's like 5%. Yeah. And the other potential great opportunity, of course, is the manufacturers and factory gate, as you might call it. And there's already conversations going on around us today about that. So I think there's huge potential there. So those three areas, collaboration, understanding community demand, and making sure we get food from all the spaces, not just where we got it traditionally. I think that's a really exciting future. And most of all, collaboration is my piece, as these two know. So arrangements like and opportunities like this summit, I think, are fantastic for collaboration.
Thanks, Steve. That's great. And collaboration and engagement was the fundamental of creating the sector action plan that Stop Food Waste Australia kind of coordinated and facilitated. So it was great to have everybody come together and look at what you could do collectively that would make it better for everyone. on our journey along the supply chain, where everyone's seen the yellow vans from Oz Harvest at retail outlets and other food service outlets picking up food. But Ronnie would like to talk to you today about another initiative of Oz Harvest, which is going into the household and looking at the results of the research that Ronnie and her team have done on her Use It Up tape. So Ronnie, would you like to tell us about that, please?
Thank you. But first of all, I too would like to acknowledge that my feet are on the land of Indigenous people, and we pay our deep respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations people in this room. I also think it's just, for me, just being here today is extraordinary. In 2015, we organized the first in 2015, we took rescued food to Canberra, to Parliament House, and cooked a meal, and got our then Environment Minister, Greg Hunt. We got Mark Butler, Shadow Minister, Larissa Brent. We got tripartite agreement to halve food waste before the UN SDG goal was announced. In 2016, we had that first Zero Food Summit where there were 12 people in the room. Second Bite, Food Bank, and as many businesses plus government as we could get, 12 people. So to be here today, knowing that we spearheaded that is extraordinary. So it's a joy to see all of you in the room. What's interesting for us, and the reason we're now tackling household food waste, of course, is because we've heard it on this stage. We've heard that when people currently today think about climate action, the thing they first think about, obviously not all of you in this room, they think about solar power. They think about perhaps getting an electric vehicle, and they don't consider the impact of their own food waste in their own homes. So because of that, and knowing this, we did research, as was mentioned by Peter earlier on. We got government funding to do research to understand this notion of household waste. And we all understand now that household waste accounts for 40% of food waste. And so we looked at what were the likely behaviors. We did a likelihood matrix together with Monash University in world first research around the behaviors that households could take to minimize food waste. And that research came up with a really clear winner, really. Out of the 35 behaviors, the winner was if we all use up our food in our homes, we will contribute significantly to household waste. So on the back of that research, we then thought, how do we make this so easy for people, since we now understand that it's a behavior that they're willing to do? So to that end, we went to one of our friends, RGA, and said, help us make it as visible and as easy as possible to encourage households to not waste food. And they helped us by coming up with Use It Up tape, and it is a world first product. So we now understand and know that the research has been done as to how to get households on board to not waste food. So this is Use It Up tape. Use me, pick me, cook me. Obviously, the colors, a little bit Oz Harvest. The intention, but we are suggesting that people make their own if they don't want to get ours. It's free on our website to get, but we do have, today we have at least 200 boxes of Use It Up tape for all of you to take home. The way to use It Up tape is to tear this off, put this on a shelf in your fridge, and move everything that needs to be used up onto that shelf. And the research after the last 6 months of about 20,000 households using it has shown that they are saving 40% of their food, particularly in the fruit and veg, meat and dairy parts of their budget. They are saving 40% of their food from going to waste, which also translates into a cost saving of around the research shows between $1,500 and $3,000 will be saved by households if they minimize their food waste. So from our points of view, we want every Australian to use it up tape, because we've been talking about 8 years to 2030. Well, I've got news for you. It's 3,000 days. It's not 8 years. We're already almost 7 and a bit years. 3,000 days in which to get our country to halve food waste. So whilst, of course, we continue to rescue food from all of the supply chains, and we're delivering that to the agencies that we support daily, we also have our free supermarket, which that's only in New South Wales. And we also have our Refectoria, our restaurant, which I will share with all of you, won an award at the Good Food Guide Awards on Monday night as the best restaurant for food for good, which was very exciting since we didn't even know that we were going to we were in that. But the point is, we're very, very committed to halving food waste. We put a stake in the ground, and the way we're going to do that, apart from the tax incentive, which we believe is fundamental, apart from rescuing food, which we know is going to go and feed vulnerable people, but by using it up, each and every one of us can start halving food waste in our own homes. That's where the impact will be felt.
Thanks, Ronnie. It's interesting that something as kind of concise and discrete as a piece of tape can change behavior to that extent. So that's wonderful. Brianna, while we're on households, what we've heard a number of times this morning, the hunger report mentioned. And so the reason that we're worried not only about food waste, but about food insecurity. Can you tell us a bit about what came out of this year's hunger report? What's changed? And I don't think it's for the better.
No, it's not. Thank you. And I absolutely take on board Pip's great advice earlier about dropping the term food insecurity and replacing it with hunger. Technically, they're not the same thing. Food insecurity is a spectrum from feeling a bit worried or anxious about whether you've got enough resources to access healthy, safe, nutritious food, right through to the most severe form of food insecurity, where people are skipping meals. They are going entire days without eating. And the Food Bank Hunger Report has been running for more than a decade now to really pinpoint where food insecurity is happening in our community, why it's happening, what are some of the drivers, and more importantly, what are some of the solutions. This year's report was really confronting for us. It showed on any given day throughout Australia there are more than 500,000 households who have someone experiencing food insecurity, and they're probably not who you think. You would hear me a lot talking about the fact that once upon a time we talked about the work of food relief organisations as helping homeless people living on the street. Well, I'm here to tell you it's people living on your street, not the street. This is something that is confronting all of our communities. We know more than 54% of those experiencing food insecurity have got a job. They're employed in some way. These are your neighbours, your school community, your sporting community. And what we're seeing at the moment is this collision between a cost of living crisis, an income crisis, and a climate crisis. And when you've got some level of resilience to withstand rising household costs or energy costs or costs of your rental or housing more broadly, you might be able to withstand that for a little while. But then you throw into that 5, 6, 7 consecutive floods. And then you throw into that you're living on the lowest level of income. And unfortunately for many families out there, when you take away what your income is and you subtract from that your rental or your mortgage costs, your medication and your school fees and your electricity costs and your transport costs, the only thing that's left to cut from your household budget is food. And it's the reason why Steve and Ronnie and myself are seeing this extraordinary increase in demand for food relief, particularly fresh produce. And I was chatting to the team at Food Bank New South Wales and ACT only very recently, who had done a pop-up food bank in a regional part of New South Wales. They were incredibly grateful for the staple ambient pantry products that we were able to provide. But what reduced them to tears was fresh produce, because they can't afford it. They can't buy it in the supermarket, and the only way they can access it is through food relief. And it's one of the reasons we are so incredibly passionate about achieving the reforms in this paper. And please, I implore you, read this report and get involved in advocacy, because we need for the government not only to agree, and we heard some wonderful positive remarks from our Environment Minister about what we all need to do collectively. Well, it's time for government to do some heavy lifting as well. The Australian food and grocery industry provides food and groceries to the retail value of $250 million each year to Foodbank. The rounding errors associated with these tax reforms, the cost, the foregone revenue to the federal government of implementing these tax reforms is tantamount to a rounding error for the federal government. It's nothing. The benefits to society of introducing this are huge. And that 500,000 households I talked about before, collectively, we're only getting to just over 300,000 of them. There's a big gap. We've got the capacity, the capability, the skills, the passion, the drive to solve this problem. Ronnie talked about 3,000 days to halving food waste. It's also 3,000 days to achieving zero hunger. We've got some work to do, but I am so proud of the work that the Fight Food Waste CRC, that Stop Food Waste Australia, that the many organisations and companies in this room are doing, because you're right there with us. We're not walking this road on our own. You are there to champion these initiatives and to make this change happen. And if you want to find out more, please hit us up lunchtime, this afternoon, whenever you like, because we are determined to make this change happen. And Carolyn, thank you for your leadership. It's been exemplary.
Oh, my pleasure. We've got some questions now starting to come through, but some of the rest of you may have questions as well. I've got one here, and I'll go straight to Georgie because I've read it in the report. Is there a case where businesses generating more food waste and surplus to get tax incentives? Can they go into the tax incentive business? What would, they would get paid more for creating more waste. Can you explain that? Because you've looked at it.
We did, and it was something that we explored with businesses when we had this conversation. And I think there's an underlying key message in all the conversations that we had, was that the ultimate objective was to, of course, half reduce food waste, full stop. And so they didn't see that this was a greater incentive to shift or to change behaviours to overproduce, just to feed it into the food relief ecosystem. And many commented that over time, hopefully the tax incentive will no longer be required. And so what it did was create a bridging opportunity to really deal with the challenges that we've just talked about, to really set us on a pathway that allows us to address the hunger challenge we have now, deal with some of the food waste challenges that we have in the supply chain. But the tax incentive is one lever, Carolyn, as we know. It's not the only lever. But it was, by all means, every organisation gave the feedback to say this wouldn't incentivise us to continue to produce and to use this as a way to go and access a tax incentive, but it recognised the contribution that they are already making into the ecosystem and helped relieve some of the cost pressures that they have to supply into the food relief organisations.
Yeah, because I do just want to acknowledge every business that to date, without any incentive, has committed to giving food. So I think we really do need to acknowledge that we all exist because we've managed to tap into that food supply. But we know that there are so many more businesses that would benefit our recipients if we could get that passed.
And what I particularly love is it's about stimulating regional economies as well. If we look at where the manufacturing base is and where the growing regions are in Australia, by having these tax incentives there, it is a way of stimulating regional economies. It's about supporting those small businesses, those family businesses who are so incredibly generous. It costs them money to donate right now. We want to make it easier.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, one of the other interesting lenses is every role of the participant in the supply chain. And many organisations found the tax incentive as an opportunity, if there was a product that was out of spec, if we're at the retail end, to actually give a direction to that supplier of an alternative pathway for that produce. Whereas at the moment it's a pure rejection. Actually, here's a mechanism that you can undertake. So they actually saw a responsibility and a way to be champions to help at all facets of the value chain to continue to have an option to redirect and to manage some of the product that can't necessarily go into some of those retail channels as well.
And I think another exciting thing about the tax incentive is it makes it easier for legislators to adopt, because it's not like it's something that hasn't been tried in some form or other overseas. It's not like we're making this up. It's worked. So let's, because we know legislators aren't keen to experiment too much.
Crusoe, yeah.
There's a track record.
So it's a
Exactly.
track record.
We'll turn to a bit of a different question. It's kind of in the same vein, but it's not about the tax incentive, but it's about, given the massive amounts of food that's not currently being captured, what would you say to those who see a conflict between food waste prevention and food rescue? You know, if we did a fabulous job of food waste prevention, what's going to happen to food rescue?
We've all got an answer to that.
I think you all have an answer to
We're all
that.
trying to put ourselves out of business, right? So if that's
I'm
successful.
looking at faces in the room, because those of you that were on the bid committee with me for the evolution and ultimate success of the Fight Food Waste CRC will know that the government probity officers in the room asked us that very question and asked me that very question. I welcome changes in reducing food loss on farm and food waste in our supply chains. That is to be commended, and I encourage it, and we absolutely, as a sector, are embracing it. But I don't think, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where there is no surplus in our supply chains. I know we've got a fascinating discussion this afternoon around bread and what's going on in the bakery sector. Are we ever going to reach a point where there is so little surplus that we can't rescue it? I doubt it. But I want to make sure that as a food relief sector, we have the capability to be able to respond to any opportunities in the supply chain. And again, I've used that term. We don't have a supply chain at Foodbank, we actually have a surprise chain. We never know what we're going to get day in, day out. And as long as we've got the innovation and the technology that we've all been talking about today to capture that, and I know with this food donation tax incentive, we're all going to have to increase our capabilities and capacities, because we'll be issuing tax donation receipts like they're going out of fashion. But at the end of the day, the political will is the bit that's holding us back. The rest is going to happen.
But I also believe that education and awareness is such a huge part of any incentive that comes in and any minimization of waste. So for example, we're completely committed to education. We educate consumers around how not to waste food. We educate kids in schools through our Feast program on how to become climate activists. And we educate vulnerable people on how to live on a budget, how not to waste food, and how to rather spend $5 on lentils and a vegetable rather than $10. And I'm not bagging Macca's here. We love Macca's, but if you could learn how to cook. And so we're very involved in programs that uplift vulnerable people whilst we're working to minimize food waste.
Excellent.
So I think that's hugely important.
Steve, did you have anything?
No, I agree with everything that's been
Perfect.
said.
Okay. How do you qualify the food donated as usable? That it has enough shelf life, as opposed to just being passed on with limited use? So is that an education piece as well?
I can tackle, we tackle it from a food science and food safety perspective at Foodbank. So we work very closely with our food and grocery partners around what we can take past a best before date. So use by date, best before date, very different things. I know in this audience you can school me rather than me schooling you, but we make sure that any food that leaves a food bank warehouse, essentially in its simplest forms, if I wouldn't feed it to my children, then it's not leaving the warehouse. And you know, it's about food safety, it's about eatability, and ensuring that we may have Good Samaritan legislation here to protect us, but we also have a moral and ethical duty to be able to understand what can be distributed, how to stop the clock. And I have to say, one of the big challenges in the food waste reduction space is transport and logistics. Chilled transport in a really fragile supply chain environment right now is bloody hard to get, and it's very expensive too.
So from our points of view, every one of our drivers and our vehicles are all refrigerated. Every one of our drivers is trained in safe food handling. So it doesn't come to us if it wasn't fit for consumption. So it's very much about taking perfectly good quality food, which is really what is going to waste. We're not talking about the inedible organic waste that currently is going to feed animals. We take perfectly good, fit for consumption food, and it stops at the supplier. We make sure that our people are trained, and our suppliers' people are trained. And so it is about, and you said the pause button. The pause button is a freezer. And a lot of our suppliers will freeze the meat for us on the day before that it's due to its dates. And we did bring up the biggest.
It was a Dorothy Dixer, Ronnie. I was giving it to you.
Yeah, is the whole notion of dates and labelling. And we are working very closely to try and advocate to shift and change the understanding around use by, best before, and looking at what's happening globally to understand how we change those, because it's such an area for food waste. How many of you have got someone in your family, because I know none of us would do that, who pick up something on the day that they might never have even opened it and throw it in the bin because it said, I must. I mean, we encounter that every single day. So labeling is such a huge reason for food waste.
And the CRC is just kicking off a date labeling project that's funded by a number of the states and territories that are in the audience today, and we're really thankful for that. And they will look first at what people's expectations are, and just that, you know, do they even remember the old sniff test? Probably not.
Well, we've got the, do it like your granny.
Yeah, exactly.
Smell, sniff, taste.
But then they'll move on to regulators with FSANs and others to actually look at industry and food, you know, what you guys would expect for your clients.
Carol, all that is, I think systems are really important, and obviously to get that chain, that cold chain working, comms and education, communication education with your own people, with the upstream and with the downstream, so suppliers, helping them understand what they can do to help us get extended life out of food like that, and obviously the agencies who work closely with them. And as has been mentioned, sometimes they haven't got the freezers, they haven't got the capability, so we can perhaps help them with that capacity thing, as I said before. And I'm a big fan of the smell test. I think that's...
Indeed. Our grannies did know what they were doing. They knew how to do leftovers as well. Thank you, everyone. I've run out of questions. Anybody, I can almost see. If anyone wants to put up their hand and shout something out.
Carolyn, one over here.
Okay, right.
Can't hear.
Cool.
And I think I just wanted to ask from your area of expertise, and it's one of the issues that I see in the field of in the sector of food insecurity is the stigma associated with access to food. And then we do say that there is zero hunger, which is a very big issue, and we're fighting food waste. But then how do we get the people within communities to go and get the access to food that they are eligible for?
Yeah. Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I will. So one of our PhD students has asked a question about how people have hesitancies about accessing and admitting, you know, the stigma, you know, if they're on our street, are they going to be coming forward and asking for food? And how do we overcome that stigma and enable that to happen in a more equitable
food
way?
With dignity and respect. And by,
The numbers are actually in this year's Food Bank Hunger Report. It actually showed that 90% of people know how to access food relief. They know where we are, they know how to get it, but the biggest number one issue stopping them from doing that is shame, stigma and embarrassment, closely followed by someone else deserves it more than I do. Well, I'm here to tell you, if you can't feed yourself and you can't feed your family, you deserve that assistance. And as Ronnie said, this is about providing dignity of choice. It is about being welcoming and comforting, and it's also about us busting myths in community. We don't need to judge and shame people for finding themselves in tricky positions. And I think if there is one thing we need to remember from COVID, there is no reason that we can't find ourselves in this set of circumstances. Every one of you would know someone who lost hours or lost a job or struggled with rental affordability throughout COVID. Was that their fault? Does that mean they don't deserve assistance when they need it? We have to make it a positive, welcoming environment, and we as a community need to actually make this normal and do to food insecurity what we did to mental health 20 years ago. Bust it out of the shadows.
Just to throw in an anecdote, when I was talking to one of our agencies a couple of months ago, we were talking about the sort of people who came in, and he did mention that the cohort was changing from, you know, the working poor is now a big part of it, to quote that person. And he mentioned the story of a woman who came in every week in a late model BMW. I'm sure others will have similar stories. And the person who was at the front who just kept an eye on things, said, I just feel uncomfortable about this. And eventually they just had a conversation with the lady, very respectful, and said, look, I've just noticed, can we understand how we can help you better? And she said, you probably think I'm taking this food home to myself because I drive a nice car. And I said, no, we're just long story short, there were people in her street. So this is not people, she wasn't even going to another suburb. There were people in her street who were really struggling. She knew them, had known them when they weren't having hard times. And her self-professed role was to go to the food agency on their behalf.
So we'll start and end on collaboration, which is what that is. I think our session is slightly under, but it's right before lunch, and we started slightly late, so I think we're probably at the time to thank our panel for their great insights, enthusiasm, and commitment to collaboration and to helping out food insecure folks. So thank you so much.